Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm George Daley, the Dean of Harvard Medical School, and thank you for joining us today for this discussion of vaccines, which has been organized by the Massachusetts Consortium on Pathogen Readiness, or MassCPR. It was only a year ago, in last December, when a small cluster of cases of a severe respiratory illness emerged in Wuhan, China. This was an entirely new human disease that would become known as COVID-19, and this highly contagious disease has now swept the globe. But remarkably, less than a year later, there are 2 COVID-19 vaccines undergoing regulatory review at the US FDA, and a number of additional vaccines in the late stages of clinical testing. With emergency use authorization, these vaccines can be rapidly deployed, which we hope will mark the beginning of the end of this pandemic. From novel virus to vaccine in less than a year, I must underscore this. Before COVID-19, the typical timeline for vaccine development might have been 3 to 9 years. With COVID-19, that timeline has been dramatically compressed. A successful vaccination campaign against COVID-19 will be one of the greatest scientific success stories of our time. Now, this dizzyingly rapid virus to vaccine translation of basic science into a life-saving clinical treatment has been made possible by decades-long investments in the biomedical sciences, and especially fundamental efforts to understand the molecular machinery of both microbes and humans. A triumphant vaccine is science, medicine, and public health at its best, highlighting the essential value of scientific expertise. Now, the tremendous promise of the vaccine notwithstanding, we must be clear about the challenges ahead. Many unknowns remain about both COVID-19 vaccines and the disease itself. Chief among these unknowns, how long will vaccine-induced immunity last? And how might immune protection vary across different populations? Second, achieving herd immunity is predicated on vaccine acceptance and uptake. Even the most effective vaccine is only as good as the number of people willing to get it. For that, earning the public's trust is key, and we are facing a severe challenge: public skepticism and vaccine hesitancy. Now, vaccine mistrust is dangerous, but so is overconfidence. So at the other end of the spectrum, we need to be wary of the dangers of magical thinking, of seeing vaccines as a silver bullet. Vaccines will not offer an overnight solution. We have to temper our optimism with a dose of reality and brace ourselves for many more months of infection prevention and distancing measures as the vaccines are rolled out. No vaccine, no matter how effective or safe, can correct the underlying pathologies that fuel health disparities in COVID-19 and beyond. These disparities are a symptom of a far deeper systemic illness, inequity, driven by socioeconomic factors and decades of underinvestment in public health. As a society, we can ill afford to celebrate our triumphs in science if we do not redouble our efforts to address our failures elsewhere. As we near the beginning of what will be the most ambitious vaccination campaign in human history, let us not be lulled into complacency. Let's remain vigilant, because the next few months will see the highest burden of infection yet, and there will be much suffering before the pandemic subsides. And if the past is prologue, we know that the next pandemic is not a matter of if, but of when. Pandemic preparedness for the future is one of the very reasons we launched the MassCPR, the organizer of today's session. The work of this multi-institutional consortium aims to address both the immediate implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the long-term need for enhanced preparedness against future emerging pathogens. Now, with that, I'd like to yield the microphone to our first presenter, Dr. Bruce Walker, who is a distinguished virologist and HIV researcher, who is also one of the two faculty co-leaders of the MassCPR. He will share more about COVID-19 vaccines in general, and we'll talk about MassCPR's work on the vaccine front and beyond. Bruce, over to you.
Can you hear me, George?
You're now fine, Bruce. Go ahead.
Great. Sorry for the little glitch there. Yeah, so thanks very much, George. And I'll get right into this. What we're doing today is really celebrating an extraordinary scientific accomplishment, going from the first cases of a new disease, as George mentioned, less than a year ago, to 2 vaccine trials that have both shown protection from COVID-19 disease. And this really begs the question as to how is it possible that vaccines can be made so fast without compromising safety? And the answers to that are not due to cutting corners, but really to tremendous scientific advances and to some decisions that were made early on to accelerate those aspects that could be safely accelerated. Advances in sequencing allowed for rapid identification of the virus less than a month after the first cases. That information was rapidly shared so that people around the world could start adapting existing proven vaccine technologies to this new disease. Unprecedented collaboration and catalytic funding from biotech and government and philanthropy accelerated the progress. There were huge clinical trials that allowed for rapid safety and efficacy evaluation to make sure that these vaccines were not causing untoward immediate side effects. Ongoing high rates of transmission rapidly revealed the impact of the vaccines, and manufacture of vaccine doses started well before the trials were completed on the bet that the vaccines would be effective. And in fact, that ended up being a really important decision. Basic concept behind each of these vaccines is that rather than exposing people to the potential lethality of the virus itself, these vaccines basically take the spike protein in almost every case and just expose the immune system to the spike protein. That immunization then leads to induction of antibodies, and antibodies then lead to what we believe will be long-term protective immunity, but that's yet to be conclusively shown. There are a number of different vaccines that are on the horizon. The ones that are in the front right now are the genetic vaccines based on mRNA that I'll speak about first. I'll also talk about inactivated viral vectors. I won't speak as much about viral protein plus adjuvant or inactivated viruses, since those are further into the future. But let's look at the mRNA vaccines first. I mean, these are very simple vaccines. It's a small segment of viral genetic material inside of a lipid bubble that is taken up by cells. Those cells become factories to make spike protein, and spike protein is released, and that induces protective antibodies. Importantly, that process lasts in the body for about 36 hours, and then the vaccine itself is degraded and essentially gone. The safety and efficacy of these mRNA vaccines is really quite stunning. It's important to note that efficacy here means protection from symptomatic disease. If we look at the Pfizer vaccine, 2 doses required, data out today suggesting that even after a single dose, there appears to be protection. The cases in people that received placebo were quite high and dramatically reduced with vaccine, efficacy of 95%, no serious adverse events, clear protection in elderly, and protection from severe disease. And the very similar results were achieved with the Moderna vaccine, really, I think, beyond anybody's expectation in terms of the level of efficacy. Also, importantly, these vaccines have been tested in humans for a number of years. So there is some background data showing that these things have not resulted in longer term side effects. Next, I'd like to talk about inactivated viral vectors, the next to come along. And those are for our purposes, AstraZeneca and Janssen are the companies. And if we compare those now to the mRNA vaccines, I'll take AstraZeneca first. 2 doses required, but in fact, an odd result was that half dose followed by full dose seemed to give better protection. The advantage of these cold virus vectors, these adenovectors like AstraZeneca and Janssen, are that they just require a standard refrigerator and don't require the extensive cold chain freezing that the mRNA vaccines require. The Pfizer vaccine was less effective, and it's still unclear to me whether it was effective in elderly, and emergency use authorization is pending for that and for the Janssen vaccine, which actually has not yet reached an efficacy endpoint, which is expected in January. But the other 2, Pfizer and Moderna, are imminently going to be approved for emergency use, we believe, and have already been so in certain countries. If we think about these vaccines, there are a number of issues that I'd like to end with to speak about in terms of what we need to worry about. So the safety profile of these, the safety profile is obviously key, and that's being followed with no adverse events known yet. Whether these protect from further transmission is a key issue that we'll talk about probably some more in the question and answer session. Duration of protection is an important question, but early data suggests that these are going to be durable. And then special populations. The vaccines have not yet been tested in children, in pregnant women, and in immunocompromised individuals. And that's information that we need to have before they're released for those populations. Other issues, vaccine availability, logistics of the rollout, population prioritization, vaccine hesitancy, and herd immunity are all things that we'll continue to talk about during this session. And then the ethics of future placebo-controlled vaccine trials is another really important issue about whether those can be done. And we'll come back to that. So I'll stop there, George, after that brief overview.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And I know there'll be additional questions about the vaccines that have come in already from some of the audience. Let me turn it over to our next presenter, who is Margaret Hamburg, who is the former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, and as such is supremely qualified to discuss COVID-19 vaccines and their regulatory approval. I should also note very proudly that Peggy is an alum of Harvard Medical School, and she currently serves as the chair of our external advisory group at HMS, the Board of Fellows. Peggy.
Thank you so much, George. And thank you, Bruce, for that terrific presentation. In fact, many of the points that I wanted to make have actually been made by the 2 stellar and comprehensive presentations that you've heard. But let me give a little bit of perspective about sort of what to expect as this vaccine evaluation and authorization process goes forward. It is incredibly encouraging news. We are clearly on track to move forward to broader availability of the first vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, coming before the FDA, and then the Moderna later this month, unless something very surprising emerges over the next few days. But it's important to note that this is happening during the most dark period of the coronavirus pandemic in terms of what's happening in our country and in many parts of the world. But in our country, we are seeing records being broken every day in terms of new cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, and for a sustained period of time. So the good news couldn't come any sooner, but we have to recognize that we have very serious months before us in terms of impact of this devastating disease. Tomorrow is the first formal step in the process of the emergency use authorization in terms of the vaccine advisory board meeting at FDA with FDA scientists and the scientists from Pfizer. And it will be a chance for the experts, the independent scientific experts on the advisory board and those from FDA and the company to look at the data, the analysis, and discuss. It also is a public meeting. The data is now available on the website, very transparent process and an opportunity for real engagement. What will be the critical question is, does the data support the proposed emergency use authorization? Are there concerns in the data about safety or efficacy that need to be further clarified? Almost certainly, there will be discussion about what additional studies should be done by companies to further elucidate issues around safety and efficacy. Importantly, the question of duration of protection and how can we get a better answer for that. The issue of subpopulations that may respond differently, and the subpopulations that weren't part of the original studies. Children, pregnant women, although I think there were a few in the study, but not at the levels to really provide the appropriate analysis. Also, individuals who are immune compromised, very important for our understanding in terms of the eventual broad-based use of a new vaccine. And then the question about should the study in terms of the placebo control be continued, or should those in the placebo arm get vaccine now? In terms of what the discussion on safety and efficacy will be, you already got a slight preview, but the data is extraordinary, much more promising than any of us expected in terms of the 95% efficacy, the efficacy across, the subpopulation studied by age, important comorbidities like obesity and hypertension and race. Surprising to see the level of efficacy even after one dose, but the study wasn't designed to allow us to know whether one dose would be sufficient, at least in the early stages. And clearly that second dose gives a substantial and perhaps longer lasting boost to the immune protection. There are side effects in terms of local administration and complications in that initial 24, 48-hour period. Many people with swelling and pain at the site, fatigue, headache, and actually already after one day of administration in the UK, some concerns are being raised about the level of warning needed to be given in terms of the expectations. But FDA had specifically asked for a period of 2 months for half of the people in the study arm of the trial in order to look at safety, and most significant safety concerns in our past experience with vaccines appears in that period. So we're expecting that we know most of the important information about this vaccine now, but an important aspect of the decisions to be made are what kinds of ongoing studies will be required. The company will be continuing to study participants for likely a couple of years, and there will be formal FDA oversight in terms of what we call pharmacovigilance, but studying the vaccine, getting reports from various sources to identify any emerging safety concerns, and also enhance our study of and understanding of efficacy and, importantly, duration. I think that some of you may wonder what's the difference between an emergency use authorization and a full approval. In this case, not that much, really, in terms of the standards for safety and efficacy set by the FDA, because this vaccination is going to be used by so many people, and because with a vaccine, you're giving it to otherwise healthy people to protect them from disease, the standards are very high in terms of really understanding safety and efficacy and the risks and benefits. But the EUA is a legal regulatory mechanism that enables the vaccine to move out more swiftly likely be followed by a formal application process. And that will, be a more bureaucratic process, all the I's dotted, T's crossed, and it will take longer. But we will see vaccine likely go out within 24 to 48 hours after an emergency use authorization may be granted by the FDA because of this advanced manufacturing. States will have the responsibility for actual distribution, although the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice has weighed in on the first tranche in terms of the priority groups, frontline healthcare workers and elderly living in congregate settings like nursing homes. But states are defining their own plans, and it will be a very complex distribution process. It will be unlike the normal way that vaccines go out into communities, and it will put an additional burden, not just on getting the vaccine to the people who need it, but in tracking who gets it so that we can ensure that they get their second dose in the right time frame, and also so that we can track the experience of those who have been vaccinated for this ongoing pharmacovigilance. So the process of developing the vaccine scientifically was an enormous challenge and a huge accomplishment. Distribution and tracking will be at least as challenging. We hope that it will go forward as smoothly as, frankly, the science has gone, but I think we can expect there will be hiccups along the way, if not larger problems. And of course, it's happening during a transition of governance as well. So there's a lot to watch, a lot to worry about, but I think everyone involved in this enterprise is committed to doing the best job that can possibly be done. And I think that we all should be encouraged by what has been done so far and the recognition that we can begin to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But the issues to be discussed next of vaccine hesitancy are also absolutely essential to success. So I will stop there, George. Apologies for perhaps going long, but so much to discuss, and I look forward to the question and answer period.
No, your timing was spot on, Peggy. And thank you very much for your expertise, your experience, and we will certainly be bringing you back when we start to entertain questions from the audience. Let me, for the next 10 or so minutes, speak to a few of our panelists. And I think we will be visiting some of the core issues of public trust and allocation and the like. And we have three absolutely outstanding individuals to inform us. Stellar cast of infectious disease experts. I want to welcome Simone Wilds, who is the Associate Director of Infectious Disease at the South Shore Health and a Clinical Assistant Professor of Medicine at Tufts Medical Center. Robert Finberg, who is the Chairman of the Department of Medicine at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, himself an infectious disease expert who has participated and conducted critical clinical trials during the COVID era. And then Larry Madoff, who is the Medical Director of the Bureau of Infectious Disease and Laboratory Sciences at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And let me start by asking Simone, given that you are a physician on the front lines, what are you seeing in your clinic, and how are you having conversations with patients around trust? And given the fact that it's been widely publicized that there's significant vaccine hesitancy, especially in minority communities, how do we build trust and confidence in the vaccine?
George, thank you for the timely question. I will have to say that we really need to address the issues of trust in the minority communities. However, in order to do that, we have to look at the history of what has happened in the past. And when we think about this, the first thing that usually pops in everyone's mind is the Tuskegee syphilis trial. But there are many others that have occurred that have created a lot of pain for African Americans. So in order to be able to rebuild this trust with or individuals in our minority communities, we have to have conversations. And one of the first things we have to do is we have to be honest. We have to allow people to share their concerns. We have to understand the mistakes that we have made, and definitely try to see how we can really try to empathize with them during the difficulties that they have experienced. It's also important that we be transparent with all the patients, give them as much information as is accessible to us. And another issue which I think patients really like is when they have individuals delivering the messages that look like them and speak like them. That really makes a connection for these patients. And finally, you know, one of the ways that we really can help to enhance trust in this community is developing partnerships with individuals that are trusted in these communities. They can really help us to get the message out. So it's really important that as we work together, we try to do all we can, especially during this time, to build trust in the communities of color, as we really need them to get the vaccines. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Simone. You know, I'm going to ask Larry Madoff the next question, because I think in part it will be something of a segue from your comments, and it really has to do with the Massachusetts process that is in part going to be informed by this COVID advisory group for prioritizing the groups that are going to receive the COVID vaccine in Massachusetts. So Dr. Madoff, could you talk a little bit about that process, who's involved? I know a couple of our panelists are, and what you think the likely outcomes are going to be and the recommendations.
Thanks, Dr. Daley, and thank you all for joining us, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me today. As you can imagine, state government and the Department of Public Health have been really very busy with trying to plan for deployment of the vaccine. And you know, of course, it is such a tribute to science that we were able to really begin, we hope to be able to begin vaccinating people really within a year of discovery of a new virus. So it's unprecedented in that respect. We've been working in multiple channels in developing plans for vaccination here in Massachusetts. One of the most important aspects of that was the convening of an expert advisory panel that included Drs. Finberg and Wilds, who are with us today. And that was extremely important and valuable. And their insights on this panel included not just infectious disease specialists, I should add, but also political leaders, ethicists, clergy, and representatives like myself from the Department of Public Health, who were really listening to this panel. And this working group, and led by Paul Bittinger from MGH, mentioned also, came to a series of recommendations that were brought to the governor, and which I believe he's announcing as we speak, how that is being played out. This panel looked at guidance that had been issued from the national academies on prioritizing a vaccine, how to ethically and most efficaciously distribute what is going to be a scarce resource for a period of time. They also looked at deliberations of the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, that works with CDC. And using this as a background, this panel did some really impressive work in balancing the how to allocate this. And as with the other bodies, they felt that healthcare workers who were in the front lines treating COVID patients should be prioritized. And in addition to clinicians in that category, also, so importantly, this panel looked with an equity lens and how the vaccination should most support communities that have been most affected by the virus, by the COVID pandemic. And so included in that initial wave are all of the other people who work with patients with COVID. And that includes, for example, food service workers, environmental people, people who do all of the other work of patient care that are so important and vital in the healthcare setting. So those groups are clearly in the initial phases. Also, of course, as has been very publicly reported, residents of long-term care facilities, where here in Massachusetts and around the world and around the country and around the world, there was such devastating mortality associated with COVID. And this group prioritized the saving of human lives. There are many considerations that go into prioritizing a vaccine, including, preserving the essential functions of society, and but I think preserving human lives took the foreground with this group, and I think we will see that with what the governor is discussing right now and laying out the framework for allocations of the vaccine. We're expecting to receive about 60,000 doses of the Pfizer vaccine this week, we hope, and those will be deployed initially to healthcare facilities who have the capacity to manage the logistics and deploy this to frontline healthcare personnel in the first wave. I'll stop there, George. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just follow up, Dr. Madoff. With this initial allocation, what is the nature of the tracking? And will that be transparent? Will it be publicized on the DPH website? Will we be able to follow whether or not there has been adequate penetration of the vaccines into the communities of color that have been devastated in Massachusetts? And I think that would go a long ways to preserving the public trust.
So let me start by saying that Massachusetts has a lot of experience in distributing vaccines, that we every year distribute millions of doses of vaccines using similar systems to what are being used for COVID. And so we receive federal allocations of vaccine, but it's allocated to providers and healthcare facilities by the Department of Public Health. And we carefully track the distribution of the vaccine, who it goes to. We have a system in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Immunization Information System, which is a vaccine registry that records literally every dose of vaccine that's given by any provider in Massachusetts. And that includes retail pharmacies, it includes healthcare providers, it includes anybody who gives a vaccine, a public health clinic. Every single person is identified, and we know their demographics, and we track that, and we commit to transparently reporting that through the vaccine deployment process. And I will note that that was also an important goal of the advisory committee, was to make sure that we remain equitable and transparent in vaccine distribution, and we will make every effort to do so.
Thank you, Dr. Madoff. I want to comment that someone has already placed in the Q&A that they appreciate your presence and that you seem like a wonderful individual. I know you have a deep background in academia and tremendous expertise, and we're very privileged in Massachusetts to have someone of your caliber playing such an important role. And Dr. Wilds, I just might ask, before I go to Dr. Finberg for the last question of the panel, I know you're participating in this advisory group. Can you talk a little bit about your own experience and how that influences your ability to be a spokesperson for the broader community here in Massachusetts?
Yes, George, I would say this has been a really great experience to advocate for the residents of Massachusetts. One of the privileges that I've had is working with the community of colors. And I can tell you that when I speak to them, a lot of them have a lot of hesitancy about their vaccines. And one of the things I've been trying to do is trying to give them confidence about the vaccine, and also really trying to get different platforms to get the message out about the vaccines, because people want to know the information. So rather than just using the standard communication modes such as the radio and televisions, I think we have to meet people where they are. And so that means we have to go to the churches, we have to go to the barber shops, the hair salon, meeting, a lot of virtual meetings, of course, are happening, but talking to people, answering their questions, I think that's really critical to help people to understand that there has been a devastating impact with COVID, which they all know. So reaching them at their level and let them understand we're here to help. The vaccine is going to be used to prevent infections. Let us utilize it. We do not want anything else.
Oh, Dr. Wilds, thank you. I mean, your presence here and your strong voice is so valuable. Let me ask Dr. Finberg. So Dr. Finberg, you've been a prime driver of clinical trials for remdesivir, and we obviously have a number of clinical trials of follow-on vaccines, additional vaccines in the works. What is your sense of the impact of an emergency use authorization of, let's say, the Pfizer and then the Moderna vaccine on the rigor and robustness of these follow-on trials? And what would you say to individuals who might, be recruited to volunteer in these additional trials?
Well, I may have to defer to Dr. Hamburg, but I'll tell you, as an investigator in a vaccine trial and as a volunteer for a different vaccine trial, I think it's important that we do these trials. And I think our success in these two first vaccine trials is that they were very well done. And I think that the sponsors were very clear about the data. And that's why we're in such a great place. I think it is going to be a difficult decision going forward. Now that we have these data, I can tell you that Pfizer wants to break their blind and vaccinate the placebos, but that will impair getting further data. It is important, however, that we finish these trials. These Pfizer and Moderna are both 2-year trials. There's more to find out, both about the side effects, but also the immunogenicity and what might be protective levels of T cells and B cells. So I think it's important to continue the trials. What we're going to do with people who have not gotten the vaccine yet, I think, is something the FDA and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices are going to have to weigh into. Dr. Hamburg.
Well, yeah, that's a good segue, Dr. Finberg. I'm going to invite Peggy and Bruce back into the conversation. I might ask Peggy, what is your sense? I mean, how do we continue to develop these additional vaccine candidates once we've had an EUA in place?
Well, that's going to be a very robust discussion tomorrow at the advisory board meeting and going forward as well. There are, very different opinions amongst people that are quite expert and both scientifically and ethically concerned. There's a strong argument for continuing the placebo control so that we can really learn much more about this vaccine, the duration of protection, and the experience. On the other hand, we now know that it can protect against severe disease, and there is an obligation to think about those in the placebo arm who could be at risk and could in fact suffer serious disease as a result of not getting the vaccine. There's, some discussion about a sort of a crossover study where you keep it blinded, but you give the people that had vaccine the placebo and vice versa. And then you can watch the sort of change in patterns of disease and still glean some important information from it. But it's a bit different than if you were doing a standard, straightforward placebo-controlled study. There's discussion about whether the people that would meet the criteria for getting vaccine in the first priority group could get the vaccine, but the others not. But these are our hard discussions, and they will be undertaken, and they will be undertaken in a very public, transparent way. And they will have, implications, because we want to make sure that there is a very strong vaccine development process that goes forward. This is the first generation of vaccines, and they look very promising, but we need to develop new vaccines, both because certain ones may be more appropriate for use in different subpopulations. We also just need more vaccine in order to make it available, not just to all those in this country that need it, but around the world. And we may find out that this vaccine doesn't adequately actually prevent asymptomatic infection, which is one of the gaps that we've touched on in terms of our knowledge about this vaccine, which, if it doesn't prevent asymptomatic infection, then you can get ongoing spread, and that complicates our ability to really manage and control the epidemic. So there's a lot of need for ongoing robust science and research and development in the vaccine arena.
Thank you, Dr. Hamburg. I'm going to invite Dr. Walker also to comment on this. You spoke a bit to the different flavors of vaccine that are being developed, and certainly the cold chain issues and the number of doses required influence the feasibility of rolling out the vaccine in different settings. Could you speak to the value of the importance of continuing the development of some of these other vaccines, especially for communities and countries outside of the United States?
Well, I think in general, I'm hopeful that as many of these vaccines will be approved as possible, because we have such an enormous task in front of us. If we're talking about 2 immunizations, then we need over 14 billion vials of vaccine. Now, some of these vaccines are more promising in situations where there's less infrastructure. The Janssen vaccine, I think, could really change things. If a single dose can be given, the logistics of that are just so much easier than having to have people come back at an appointed time to be able to do that. And the animal model data would suggest that vaccine that was actually developed by one of the members of the MassCPR, Dan Baruch, is going to be effective. It's similar to the Sputnik 5 vaccine that's being used in Russia. That's been reported to have a 95% efficacy level. So I think it is really important that we look to make these vaccines as easy to use as possible, no cold chain, cheap, and that's something that characterizes these that are made out of the adenoviruses. I think in terms of future vaccine studies, one of the things that will help us focus is that hopefully from the current vaccines, we'll get a signal in terms of what it is that's required for protection. From animal studies that have been done, it already looks like that's a certain level of a certain kind of antibody. If we can see that we have a vaccine that's inducing that, that's from a different platform, that may already put that to the front of the line and say, this one looks really promising, to focus in on the way that Peggy had mentioned in terms of these novel trial designs to be able to demonstrate clear efficacy. I think the other important question that maybe Peggy wants to address is, what do you anticipate for children? That will the FDA likely want to have a placebo-controlled trial in children? Or do you think that the vaccines will be tested for safety in children? And if they're safe based on the efficacy in adults, do you think they'll be approved?
Well, I'll just jump in.
Please.
And I was thinking about that exact question as you were talking about the importance of really understanding the nature of the protective immune response. The more we can learn about what are the correlates of protection in terms of what response signals that the vaccine is working, the faster we can move towards studying the vaccine in other important populations for use. there will need to be studies done in children at younger ages, and those are already being planned. The Pfizer study, I think, did bring in towards the end some kids going down to the age of 12, but mainly it was an older population. But we do need to understand about the specific issues of safety in kids, dosing in kids, and of course, efficacy. So there will be additional studies done, starting really with the phase 1. But if we can better understand the correlates of protection, that can speed the process and reduce the possibility of really needing larger controlled studies of the kind that we've seen to get us where we are today. I think everybody recognizes that we'll need much smaller numbers, and we can build on the knowledge that we have as we look at the studies in these other important groups.
Thank you, Dr. Hamburg. Let me focus again on this issue of safety, which you've raised several times and is a dominant theme of many of the questions. And I might ask Dr. Finberg first to address this. There's been a report, and I'm unaware, so I'm only learning about it through the Q&A, that the Pfizer vaccine induced severe allergic reactions in 2 individuals. And you know, when you're exposing tens of thousands of individuals, you might expect an array, a diversity of different adverse events. Dr. Finberg, as an investigator, how does that kind of report make you think about the vaccine, and would it influence the nature of the recommendations that you would give to individuals about receiving the vaccine?
Well, thank you for the question. I also had not heard about that report. I can tell you that in the US, we had not seen those responses. We had not seen actually severe adverse reactions. I have certainly not seen it, but I think one takes those things very seriously. And that's one of the reasons that we're going to do follow-ups for the people that get vaccines in terms of safety follow-ups. And we'll have to find out. I mean, I think we need to keep studying it.
I mean, I think there's no question that this is more reactogenic than many vaccines in terms of the local administration and that 24, 48-hour period afterwards. I think 50% reported some fatigue, body ache, 30% chills, and a larger percentage, some local administration response. So it's clearly, you know, already demonstrated those attributes, but I haven't seen the exact reports out of the UK. I did see that they were going to put forward a warning, but I don't think we saw, you know, major allergic reactions in any of the, yeah.
Right. And there's been literally, given all of the patients, all of the individuals who have been exposed, there's literally been million years of experience with these vaccines. I mean, it's an extraordinary accumulation of data in a short period of time because we have exposed so many individuals. But we must understand that there are no interventions that are entirely risk-free. And we have to weigh the possibility of what sound like very rare adverse events and side effects against the fact that we're coming upon 300,000 deaths in the United States alone. So we have to see the impact and the benefit of a vaccination campaign against the very, very small risk of these other effects. Extending this discussion, there's a lot of questions about the communities who might get vaccinated and the concerns for, let's say, pregnant women or individuals who already have some autoimmune condition or perhaps are themselves immunocompromised. I might ask Dr. Walker and Dr. Madoff, Dr. Finberg, Dr. Wells, all of you must be thinking about these questions. Dr. Walker first.
Well, in terms of immunocompromised individuals, I think, you know, we were talking about this before, that in the context of these trials, there often are individuals who are don't know that they're immunocompromised, so they're not screened out of the trials, who then subsequently find out they are immune compromised. And so some data accrue that way. But these are really important issues that are going to have to be addressed. There's not a, they'll have to be tested very carefully in those individuals. I think the decisions to go forward will be helped by seeing what happens in those cases where immunocompromised individuals have actually inadvertently received the vaccines. Somebody with an as yet undiagnosed immune deficiency.
Other comments? Dr. Hamburg, how does one think about pregnant women in a trial like this?
Well, I think that will be one of the areas where there will be some targeted work to try to assess the issues about appropriate use in pregnant women. Many vaccines are not studied in pregnant women, and then women and their healthcare providers are left in a position where they don't know what to do. This is clearly a vaccine where we have to make it a priority to really assess it and be able to affirmatively ask and answer some critical questions. We know that many of the frontline healthcare workers today and essential workers today are women of childbearing age. We need to be able to give them answers. There is some data in the existing clinical trial data that bears on this question, but I don't know whether it's adequate to really glean much. But there were women of childbearing age included in the studies, and some did become pregnant.
And Dr. Madoff, I mean, from the point of view of the Department of Public Health, I think we have to reassure everyone that there is going to be ongoing studies and ongoing vigilance. Could you speak a bit about how the Department of Public Health monitors and will be monitoring the impact of this vaccination campaign?
Sure. And many of these are federal programs, by the way, that of course we participate in, but they're, for example, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, is one that anyone can report an adverse event to a vaccine, and there are frequent reports, and that information is also publicly and transparently available. There's a number of other systems that are in place for post-marketing or post-approval monitoring of vaccine and other drug safety. And maybe Dr. Hamburg can tell us more about that as well. But in addition, just for COVID vaccinations, there are some extra programs that are being stood up for post-use monitoring of side effects and adverse events. For example, there's a system that's being deployed where anyone at the time of vaccination can sign up for cell phone alerts and reminders, and can actually report using their own cell phone on any adverse events that they're being seen. They'll be prompted by the device, by the system, to report events after they receive the vaccine. So there will be lots and lots of systems that are going to be monitoring, I think, with these vaccines, I should say, even more carefully than usual because of the short timeline of development.
Thank you. Yeah, we're getting a lot of comments in the Q&A about the allergic reactions, and allergies are extremely common in the population, and I can just say we should be reassuring everyone that there will be intense attention paid to these events. There will be a lot of thoughtful consideration of what it means for the vaccine, for the general public, and to stay tuned as we roll out the vaccine to the many tens to hundreds of millions of individuals across the globe. We're going to be learning an enormous amount. And so I think that we have to be wary and vigilant, but we will also be listening very attentively
George, can I quickly add one point here?
Please.
Because as we are undertaking our efforts to, really speak to people where they are about this vaccine, hopefully build trust and confidence in its safety and efficacy and its uptake and use, as Simone was talking about. We also need, I think, to do a better job talking about the fact that we're going to see complications in terms of medical problems that happen. People have heart attacks, strokes, miscarriages, severe headaches, seizures all the time. Some of those things are going to happen, perhaps linked in time to having gotten a vaccine, a day before or a week before, and people will start to make associations. The press will start to pick it up. We need to really be clear and consistent in our messaging. We need to try to help people understand that, not everything that happens can be attributed to the vaccination. And we need to have the systems for tracking that Larry was talking about so that we can really assess what is related to the vaccine and act on it as needed.
Thank you very much for that statement. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll summarize because we're coming to the end of the hour. I think another theme in the questions has been, first, should those who've already had COVID get vaccinated? And second, once you're vaccinated, does that mean that we can run around carefree?
So I'll take on both.
Dr. Finberg, thank you.
The ACIP has given preliminary indications that they think 3 months, that if you've had the COVID within 3 months, you should not take the vaccine, but that's going to depend on further data coming out and may depend on different vaccines. So those are very preliminary suggestions. In terms of whether you should stop wearing a mask and stop social distancing, you definitely should not. These vaccines, no vaccine is 100% protective. And I think if we're going to end this pandemic, we need to continue to do all those things and be very vigilant about it.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Finberg. So let me finish just by saying, this public briefing on vaccines is really meant to convey the current state of knowledge and to give a sense of confidence that the vaccines are very effective and extremely safe. We're always concerned when reports of adverse events surface, as they have today. It's very important that we not overweight exceedingly rare bad outcomes, because that may keep us from achieving the tremendous benefits of a wide vaccination campaign. So we will continue to monitor these events and provide honest, candid information back to the community. But I want to finish with one question, and that is to each of the panelists, and perhaps either with a raise of hands or a simple yes or no. How many of you will be accepting a vaccine when it rolls out?
I already did.
We have, I think we're 6 for 6 on the panel. So I hope that shows the commitment of folks who are very close to the vaccines, their belief and trust. And I want to thank the panelists very, very much for their expertise, for their compassion. I also want to thank our colleagues, our supporters at the Massachusetts Consortium on Pathogen Readiness. And I want to thank our audience. There were a remarkable number of outstanding questions. I tried to capture some of the themes that many of the questions attended to. We will have more information. Please consult the MassCPR website and stay engaged. And as Dr. Finberg said, even once the vaccines are here, we're going to need to remain vigilant, wear our masks until the time where we can achieve the kind of post-COVID herd immunity and get us all back to normal. And we look forward to that day. So thanks again to our expert panelists and to all the audience. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.